Good afternoon. I am Jason Howard, President and CEO of First State Bank and Trust. I'm excited to welcome you to thank you for joining our third education series for 2022. Today, Ron Wirtz from the Federal Reserve will discuss the speed and breadth of recovery among firms, workers, in the broader Wisconsin and Minnesota economies. We'll also talk about the role of labor force on economic growth going forward. Using an interactive study, Ron will also gauge attendee sentiment regarding recent business activity, hiring demand, labor availability, and other issues. We appreciate your support of these events and encourage you to visit fsbt.com or our social media platforms to get more information on upcoming topics for the 2022 education series. I'm now pleased to introduce Ron Wirtz from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Ron is the Regional Outreach Director, and his primary responsibilities involve tracking current business conditions across the 6-state 9th Federal District, which includes Northwest Wisconsin, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. In other words, Ron talks to a lot of businesses and is here to share some of those insights today. We will have a Q&A session throughout the presentation today, including an interactive survey. Because all lines will be muted during the presentation, if you do have a question, please type it into the chat box. Ron will be happy to answer during his presentation. With that, I'll now turn it over to Ron Wirtz.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And my compliments to the bank on having this. You know, again, the bank likes to talk to a lot of business audiences. The fact that you're organizing this for your employees and for the public, and it's a series to talk about lots of different things, I think that's a great show for the community. So thanks for the invite today. I will try to do Joe justice and do at least as well as he did. I think I heard good things from Joe's presentation earlier in this series, so I will try to complement some of the things that he talks about. So before I get going, I have to give you my bozo slide. Okay, so basically the views that I give you are mine, not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So if I say anything that's inaccurate or foolish, you blame the clown and not the circus. Okay, what am I going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about the current state of the economy. The message that I want to give you right now is demand remains healthy. Okay, obviously lots of challenges, but at a bare minimum, demand is still decent. Okay, Minnesota lags the nation on some really important indicators, not by a lot of ways, but there's a fairly consistent picture with that. There are lots and lots of challenges. I think you are all very familiar, but I'll talk about a lot of them in a little bit more detail. We're talking about prices, interest rates, supply chain, Ukraine. You still have this really big labor availability problem, and I will talk a lot about that. And then you have this COVID thing that is still there. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Then I also have an interactive survey, and for those that are watching online, I need you to get your phone. Everyone here, I need you to get your phone. For this to be useful, for us to learn from the crowd, now admittedly, there's a lot of people from the same organization here, so we'll get some of the same answers from that, but I use this every time I come in front of a business crowd or any public. You have information to give me. I'm going to give you a lot of information, but a lot of the information that I gather goes to President Neil Kashkari. So whenever I'm in front of businesses, I want to hear what you have to say about what you're seeing in the economy, so I can take that back to Neil. Again, always as a channel check, a little bit of a tracking of what's going on in the local economy wherever I happen to be speaking. So I'm going to give you a lot of data. Don't invest much on any particular slide in the chart that I have up. Okay, I'm not going to stand very long. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint afterwards and have a little bit longer look afterwards. Okay, so I mentioned the interactive survey. So if you could get out your phone, this is the one chance you get to have your phone out and play with it like a 13-year-old. Okay, so this is your chance to let the Minneapolis Fed, and for those that are on, for those people that are online, you can participate. I would like you to participate. The more people that participate, the better the information is that you give me to take back. Okay, it gives you an opportunity to tell the Minneapolis Fed what you think about the economy. So if you have your phone, you're going to send a text to this person, 22333. Okay, pretend that's your mom, your dad, a significant other. Okay, you're going to text the word Minneapolis. Okay, if it capitalizes, that's just fine. Then you're going to hit send. Somebody tell me you should get a pop-up box that says you are logged in to this particular survey. And you're going to stay in text mode, okay, for the survey. You're going to hit a letter and basically hit send, except for one word cloud. Okay, you don't hit that hypertext link that's in the pop-up box. Okay. Vinny, if you could, the only two relevant directions are the step 2 and step 3. If you maybe want to put those in the chat box for anyone having difficulty online, that they'll be available for folks. Okay, let me get started. So measuring the economy big picture. I'm guessing most people in this room online are familiar with this gross domestic product. So one of the things I should note, I index a lot of my charts because I want to compare Minnesota and Wisconsin and the U.S. On different metrics. So basically, I'm going to pick a date, I'm going to tie it to 100, and all this is a rate of change over time. Okay, that helps me compare differently sized things to one another as a rate of change. So what you see here in terms of real gross domestic product, so adjusted for inflation, we all familiar with the big V that happened. What's happening recently, so the most recent data we have is the Q1 for 2022, excuse me. And we do see that there's a little bit of decline. We saw really very strong GDP growth since the first part of the pandemic. And we see a little bit of decline here. Most economists are viewing that a little bit differently than you might think, in that it's never good to have a negative number. But what we saw is that exports were down and imports were up, so we're seeing some supply issues really affected. And what we did see is that consumer spending and business investment was still strong. That is one of the things that I think we were looking for, and that I think give us a little bit of confidence that that number's maybe not as negative as we might otherwise think. Right now, what we're hearing kind of whispered numbers is somewhere in the neighborhood slow, but maybe 1% growth in the coming quarter. A lot of volatility, a lot of challenges. So again, you got to take. I kind of expect there to be a fairly notable revision, plus or minus 0.5%. But again, negative, not good. We're seeing a lot of challenges. I'll talk a little bit about those. The other way we'd like to think about, like how is the economy doing? A couple of easy measures, unemployment. So I'm going to talk about two different measures. The U3 measure is the one that you read about when you're online. So when you hear about the official unemployment rate, that's called the U3 rate. And what we're seeing, what I'll typically do, this is supposed to be red, but it doesn't come out on that. So this tannish line is Minnesota. You got Wisconsin here. The U.S. is always in black. Okay, keep black here. So the good news, come down very far below pre-pandemic levels. So unemployment very low. The other thing we look at though is this U6 measure. Oh, the other thing I should mention, very low. It's still not low for everybody. Black unemployment is still 6%. Okay, that has to start mattering to us more. Okay, if we're talking about an economy that works for everybody, we really have to pay attention to those areas where we have softer labor markets and find a way to bring those down. Okay, so I want to make sure that everyone's familiar with that. Then again, this U6 rate, basically what this is, economists like this measure a little bit more because it has a little bit more liberal definition of what unemployment is. Unemployment is you simply have to be looking for work. Okay, this is a measure that says I'm not necessarily looking for work right now. It includes additional measures. I give the definition down here. You won't be able to read it, but you can read it afterwards if you get the PowerPoint. It includes those who haven't looked for work for 12 months but would like a job, and those that are working part-time and volunteer but would like full-time work. Okay, so it's a little bit better measure of what we call real-world slack, and it is roughly, it's still a little bit elevated over pre-recession levels, not much, but it is about double what the unemployment rate is. So we know there is some labor slack. Then we talk about employment, okay? So part of the thing, so we had really low unemployment, okay? But what you see here is that if you were to ignore this big volatile period right here, this actually would be pretty strong employment growth. It would be way strong if you look pre-pandemic, pretty flat. The reason it's like this is we've had all of these job losses. So the rate is not bad. We're still nowhere close. 100 would be back to pre-pandemic levels, actually a little bit above that. Pre-pandemic here. So we have fair ways to go to get above pre-pandemic levels in terms of employment. Despite the fact that we have really low unemployment, the trajectory now, it looks like you're going to go way out here on multiple quarters for Minnesota to go back to pre-pandemic employment levels, and much slower than the U.S. trend. Minnesota actually, Wisconsin and Minnesota are both either in or close to the bottom 10 in terms of recovery of jobs since the pandemic, started. There is some good news though. I think there's a fair amount of good news in going on in the economy right now. It really has unleashed new businesses. We don't know exactly whether or not whether this trend will hold or what is going to come out of these new business developments, but applications are up very significantly. This is the federal database here. The one on the right is a state databases. Okay, they measure slightly different things. Both show exactly the same trend. Generally speaking, for lots of different reasons, we're seeing more new business startups. And sometimes we don't know that it's a going concern, but it's doing things like taking out an EIN or doing other things, filing with the state to incorporate as an LLC or a corporation. Okay, in general, what we know is that the trend of those things are going up. Okay. We pay a lot of attention to construction, and I always like presenting just the general trend. This is a 6-month rolling average, so it's got a little bit of seasonality into it. Here's roughly where the pandemic starts, okay? And generally what we're seeing is some volatility, as you always see, but generally speaking, construction starts have held pretty steadily over the last 2.5 years. Both in Wisconsin, this one is Minnesota, and here in Wisconsin. Actually, Wisconsin seeing a little bit better overall trend, a little bit lower total, but a little bit more positive trend. And I expect in both of these cases they were low, but that's again because where we are in the trend, where we are in the construction cycle. I expect both of these to continue higher. Okay, one of the things we found out though, so I've given you a lot of kind of broad information about what's happening in the economy. What we found out during the pandemic is that we really didn't have a good real-time sense of what's going on. There's lots of good data out there. A lot of it was really timelines for the purposes of the Federal Reserve System, especially when the pandemic first hit. So we realized we really had to push out into the business community for them to give us feedback more regularly on what was happening. So a couple of interesting things have come out of that. We actually have started 3 new surveys. A couple of the biggest surveys that are in the Federal Reserve System right now. We do a general business one that will be going out in July. We just got done with this one in May, and this one we did in April. Okay, and I'm going to be giving you a little bit of information from not the hospitality one, but the general business and construction survey. So these are insights from firms across that 6-state region that the Federal Reserve covers. So as I mentioned, we really like following construction, mostly because it's a good bellwether industry. Okay, you're not going to build a house, you're not going to put up an apartment complex that's right over here, you're not going to build an office building if you don't have some confidence in the future of whether or not you're going to get enough people to pay whatever mortgage you have on it. Okay, so we really do think it's a leading indicator of confidence. And so we do a construction survey, and I believe this is on about 260 construction firms, mostly in the Twin Cities and greater Minnesota, but there is probably 20 to 25% respondents in the other states. Generally speaking, the thing that we noticed in our most recent survey in April, we saw cancellations kind of significantly and steadily declining until the most recent one. So we saw a very notable uptick in cancellation and projects that were canceled. Sorry, let me say that over. We saw a notable increase in the number of firms that have seen some increase in cancellations of projects that they had on the books. Okay, lots of reasons for that. I'll talk about some of those. We also look at project delays. We asked them about that, and I think everyone, if you're involved in any kind of development, you know this story. Generally speaking, delays just getting worse and worse and worse. Okay, now it's time for those online. I need you to grab your phone. So now that I'm through this, I've given you some data. I'm kind of curious what you're seeing in whatever areas that you are working in. So how's business? So all I need you to do is hit the right letter or type the right letter and hit send. Okay, so here, if you are, let's say you're not tied to a business, if you're online here, I'm interested in what you see either in the business you work at, or if you're retired or not attached to a business, what you see in your community. Just give me a gut sense. And here we're talking over the last 2 months, so roughly May and June compared to the same period last year. And here, if there are any questions for those online or here in the audience here, while we're doing these surveys, it's a great time for me to answer questions if you happen to have any at this point. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, a little bit softer than I've probably seen recently. But the good news is that, things are at good levels, maybe not a lot of change, but for those that are not seeing that, we're seeing growth. That has been very consistently the message when I'm in front of business groups. I am hearing that growth is good. That's a positive message. Challenges, okay? There are lots of them. And I'll talk a fair amount about a couple of these. So in the general business survey, this is the construction survey. Basically what we've seen is that there are kind of three challenges that really rise to the top, okay? Material input cost, labor availability, and supply chain disruptions. Those are really the three biggies that are very, very consistent. In the general business survey that we do, I would say they are a little bit lower than in the construction survey, mostly because everything in the construction is so input heavy that they really experience all of these challenges kind of to a greater extent. But it's very similar with other kinds of businesses as well. Okay, let me talk about each of those challenges and a couple others actually. But first, get your phone again. I want to hear about inflation. So inflation is clearly an issue, okay? Has to do with those rising prices things. We're curious because we're trying to get a better handle on how people are reacting and how it's affecting. So how has inflation, how has it impacted your company and your household or your household? And not surprisingly, pretty significant, okay? Moderate, I always hate to, kind of put, I don't know what significant or moderate means to everybody, but I try to give, people a range of choices, and this is very notable. I think it's hard to fill up your car, it's hard to go to the grocery store without realizing cheapers. There's an extra couple $100 at least a month. If you're driving a lot, a heck of a lot more than that. So we know that there has been a very negative impact on people and their budgets. So let's unpack inflation a little bit. So first thing, before you invest too much in the chart itself, so to talk a little bit about how the Fed thinks about inflation, the first thing to know is, so the thing you read about in terms of inflation is called the consumer price index. That's the number or the index that you read about when you're online and reading the news, okay? The way that is computed is there is a standard basket of goods. Okay. And it is priced, that exact basket of goods is priced in June, it's going to be priced in July, and it's going to be priced in August. Okay, same exact basket of goods. Okay, very useful measure. The Fed likes to use a measure that's called a personal consumption expenditures index. Okay, the reason we like this one better is because when prices go up, people tend to substitute goods. So in that basket of goods, if I had beef in there, okay, we all know most people are probably beef eaters in the room. Probably know that the price of beef has gone dramatically higher, okay? When that happens, I am probably going to substitute more chicken in my basket, in my actual grocery basket, okay? And this personal consumption expenditures index factors for that substitution effect. So in July, if I had a lot of beef in there, and in August, I have chicken in there instead of beef, my household budget has that reflection of that substitution. Okay, so that's why we like to follow this particular one, because it's a better measure of household inflation. So the other thing to think about when you're talking about inflation is that not all goods are considered, not all things that we purchase are the same. So here you have durable goods, non-durable goods, and the definition for durable, expected to last more than 12 months. Non-durable, less than 12 months, okay? And you see very different trajectories here, both high, well above what the Fed would normally feel comfortable with. And then you have services much lower. How did that happen? Well, if you go back to the pandemic, start of the pandemic, lockdown, everybody's in their home. All of our consumption, not all of it, but a very significant portion of our consumption transferred to goods, and mostly durable goods. So we went out and we were going to be home. Well, God darn it, we're going to finally upgrade our furniture. We're going to get stuff for an office. We're going to buy a few TVs. Okay, and the service is Netflix. So you spend $20 getting more service to your TVs, but you bought a lot more other stuff. Okay, that's why, and when that happened, we rushed into goods, but producers weren't prepared for that. Okay, that's why you're going to stores and seeing empty shelves. There's more to it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's kind of fundamentally what happened. We pushed into goods, producers couldn't keep up, so prices rose. Okay, non-durables less so. If you think about grocery, that definitely has gone up. Okay, but it has gone up a little bit less. Services, because we got out of services, we've seen a much flatter inflation line, barely back to where pre-pandemic index would indicate. Okay, because we weren't consuming as much of them. For our money, we think if COVID ever relents, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how it affects us now, if we can ever get to a point where we can control the surges, we think there's going to be a shift more towards services. We are seeing it now. Credit card data is suggesting that we are starting to rotate back into services more. That's a good thing, at least in terms of inflation. But there are other things that are probably going to have to happen as well. Any questions? I know this inflation topic in particular is sensitive. If there are any questions, I'd love to chat about that now. Yes.
Okay, so if the Fed is going to continue to raise interest rates in order to try to bring that rate of inflation down to 2%, how long, we know that will happen, for the rates will continue to go up, but how long do you think that's going to take?
For it to get back under 2%?
Yes.
Okay, first my bozo slide. Because that's well above my pay grade. What I will say, what I will say is, we don't know how long. What I do get a report. It's called the Blue Chip Indicators. It is a report from 50 different economic shops, Ford Motor Company and Stanford and JP Morgan, and their prognostication right now is that we might see somewhere closer to 3% by the end of next year. But again, bozo. I can't speak for them. I think what the Fed is doing is as I'll talk a little bit about this in a second. We've made some very aggressive moves lately. I think we're continuing to be willing to make aggressive moves in order to bring inflation down. The last numbers for May weren't very encouraging on that part. We're seeing very high. We're trying to communicate to the market that we're very serious about bringing rates down. When it happens, oh boy, again, I'm really not enough of a first, I think it's foolish to try to predict, because in the pandemic, as soon as we thought we knew what was happening, you got another monkey wrench in. So what I can say is that we are trying to do a very aggressive job in bringing rates down. How quickly to 2%? I don't think we're really looking for 2% right now, because much like the 2% is a target, it's not a ceiling. So we were under 2% for what, 14 years, okay? Very rarely did we get above 2%. It's not a ceiling, it's a target. So if we get closer to 2%, all other things being equal and employment still going up, that's probably something we can live with for a little bit, with the intent still to get closer to 2% over time. I think right now we're probably more interested in getting more in the ballpark, because we're not in the ballpark right now. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay, Neil, for those that aren't familiar, Neil Kashkari is president of the Minneapolis Fed. He is on the FOMC. He is in that room every time they meet. He is a rotating vote member. For those that maybe don't want to, for those that don't know, kind of the idiosyncratic, you know what I mean. There is a rotating schedule among the district banks. Only New York is always voting, and there's a rotating vote. So Neil essentially is a voting member once every 3 years. Okay, but he always gets to have his opinion heard. So they go around, and all of the district bank presidents, they get to, essentially have voice in there, but they don't always get a vote. And then it's the board of governors that always have a vote as well. So Neil, very clearly, he has been very dovish. Okay, he's been dovish in the sense that he wanted to keep rates low, because we really think a strong economy is going to bring a lot more people who want to work into the labor market, and that's going to be better. Especially talked about 6% Black unemployment. That's really a really important thing to him, that we think about monetary policy in a different way in terms of trying to bring more people who have been underrepresented in employment and have not experienced very good employment outcomes. And we think that monetary policy has a role to play there. Okay, he has since changed his view on what the current arc is in terms of interest rates, and he acknowledges. He wrote an essay. If you're interested in reading, it's a really good essay. I think it's a really nice kind of honest assessment of what he thought and what he thinks now. So you can just Google that phrase there. It's a great read. It'll also be an embedded link if you get this PowerPoint from me. But basically, he said when inflation accelerated last year, I argued it was likely due to transitory factors which would soon pass. It hasn't happened. Okay, he acknowledges that. The Fed acknowledges that. I think what happened is that I think everybody in the room probably expected things to go much closer to normal once we got the vaccines. We had low uptake, we had surges. Things happened since then that have essentially said that COVID really continues to be a global disruptor. When you had 50 million Chinese people, when we're talking lockdown, this is lockdown. Okay, all of those surges across the world impact a lot of the supply chains, which should affect a lot of pricing. Okay, the other thing is that when the vaccine came out, we really expected that increase in labor to be able to start to cure some of the supply chain problems that we had. We kept having these surges though. The unexpected though, after a while, is that we kind of expected consumer demand to kind of fall back, and it really hasn't happened. The good news in that sense, though, is that a lot of the reason that demand hasn't abated is that we're seeing rising disposable income because wages are going up. So we haven't seen quite the pullback in consumer demand that we expected. Yes, there were stimulus. Yes, there were PPP loans. We do know that those clearly helped demand, but you have to also remember some of it was literally demand replacement because we fell in a hole, and so some of it was demand replacement. We can argue a lot about how much that is due to the stimulus, how much inflation is. What I would say is we're more than a year past the last stimulus. I think right now it's the fact that consumers are still fairly confident and their incomes have risen for those that are working. That is the thing that I think we didn't expect a year ago when we were talking about this a little differently. So as your question gets to, we've been pretty aggressive in raising interest rates, 25 basis points in March, 50 in May, and recently 75. Neil is on record as saying he supports another 75 at the next meeting. But the thing that the FOMC has been doing is communicating what it expects to do if the current trajectory holds. But what the Fed is trying to do also is we're going to play this as it lies when we get to that point. We're going to gather as much data, and if the data changes, if the trends we're seeing change, we're going to change direction. We're going to change our approach on how aggressively, either higher or lower, on what we're going to go. But we want to communicate to the market what we expect to happen, so there aren't surprises. Okay. Now, so we've raised interest rates. I'm curious. Another question for you. Okay, what impact have recent interest rate increases had on business activity and consumer spending? Any questions yet? While this is up.
I have a question. You said that for the voting on the FOMC, it rotates with the exception of New York gets the vote every time.
Because they do the financial transactions that get federal funds.
Oh, that's why they get the consistency.
Exactly. Either that or the board of governors just likes them.
I was wondering why. Makes sense.
Yeah, they do all the financial transactions. So when we rate, we have to target that federal funds rate, the overnight exchange between banks.
Yep.
And they're the ones that, and it's a hocus pocus to me. I don't know anything really about the transactions themselves, but they handle all of that financial matter, and that's why they are always. Okay, so right now, this is kind of what I hear just anecdotally as well. We certainly don't want to say that things are not, that there are no impacts, but we are generally seeing kind of not a lot of influence on spending right now. That's both a good and a bad thing. The good thing is, as I said, there's still demand. That's a good thing. The bad thing is that if we can't tamp down demand a little bit, we're going to struggle to bring inflation down. So it's, you know, it's a double-edged sword. Challenge number 2, supply chain disruptions. I think you're probably familiar again with this. The construction survey basically says 3 out of 4 construction firms have moderate or worse difficulty getting the critical supplies they need. That's why delays are all over the place, okay? How and why? How did this happen? Well, you know, again, we talked about the fact that demand really shifted into goods, okay? That created low inventories, and so producers kind of have to do double time. They are trying to meet new demand as well as rebuild inventory, okay? And when we can't do that, prices are going to rise, okay? And supply chains are going to be more difficult. For those producers are also having a lot of problems sourcing the materials themselves, okay? That equals delays and higher costs, and they're also facing labor constraints. Okay, so they not only can't get some of the goods to make their final goods, there's a lot of labor constraints already present before the pandemic, but worsened by it. Okay. Oops, wrong brush. So to me, the lesson is, you know, we built this hyper-efficient global supply chain. It's a great thing. Okay, but it was really, really vulnerable to things like this because there's no latent capacity to tap once you really had lots of different supply chains broken. The problem is that COVID continues to really prevent this repair, okay? Because basically more people continue to be out of work than normal. And so we're still trying to do overtime in terms of getting caught up in goods, but we can't when our labor force hasn't come close to getting back to even what it was pre-pandemic, not only from a total employment standpoint, but also from whoever is working, how often you're out of work. Now, this is an experimental data set from the Census Bureau, but they started this right when the pandemic started, basically asking them, did you work last week? And if you didn't, why not? Okay, so the squiggly line is kind of the weekly average for those that were sick but not COVID related. Okay, so let's just call this roughly 5%. Then the area part of the chart. This is COVID related. I was either sick or I was caring for someone that was. So essentially you have in many places, either a doubling of the rate or a tripling of the rate of people that are out of work. So again, we're trying to produce more goods, but we are working at, let's say 90% capacity, not even 95, which is what we might expect. Plus we also are not back to what pre-pandemic employment was. So our production capacity just hasn't been able to rebound, in part because COVID continues to be present. I would say right now, it's no longer, COVID is not necessarily really a health threat like it was, for sure, but it is a workforce threat, okay? That's how I think about COVID now, in terms of why should we care about COVID? If you care about inflation, you kind of have to care about COVID. Then one last challenge, and maybe not, I forget where maybe talking about wages here too in a little bit. Ukraine and Russia, there isn't a lot to say here. They're not huge trading partners with us. Russia, I think 30th, Ukraine, not even in the top 50. But they have very notable effects on energy and ag, and that affects everyone everywhere. Okay, so it is an important conflict in terms of inflation, and that's just something the Fed has no role over. The other thing it does is it just introduces a lot more uncertainty. Consumers, businesses don't like uncertainty. Okay, it's hard to spend that dollar if you are nervous about what effects might lie down the road. And I think that the war in Ukraine really introduces that uncertainty that isn't good for growth. Okay, lastly, I haven't talked yet about labor markets. I will spend a fair amount of time on this. I will try to be done by about 10:02 and available for questions. Oops. Okay, first, survey. Okay, for those online too, grab your phones. What best describes average hiring demand here in your community? So if you live in Hudson or you live in outside communities, tell me what you generally see. So this is very typical of what I see when I'm in front of audiences. Either most or everyone is hiring. It's impossible to miss. Whether you see the signs on the side of the road or you simply look for somebody in Walmart to help, everybody's looking for labor. Okay, The data that we get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics says the same thing. So we're well above. So the red here being Minnesota, Wisconsin, US, all on very steady increasing rates for job openings. Okay, the rate of growth. We're maybe seeing a little bit of a lull now, I think, but we're still at really high levels. Really high levels. But going back to the chart I already showed you, the actual rate of employment growth isn't great. We're still not close back to pre-pandemic employment levels, okay? And we're really much slower than the US. So lots of job openings does not equal faster employment growth necessarily. Okay, why is that? So one more question. How would you describe labor availability? What do you hear from friends that own businesses? What do you hear? What do you see here in this business? Okay. Now we're starting to understand a little bit better on how those trends can be kind of not necessarily running against each other, but it helps fill in a little bit of the blank on how we could have so many jobs and not be growing as fast as we otherwise would. It's because labor is either moderately tight or very tight. Okay, employers are doing a very good job in a lot of ways in terms of responding. We are seeing very steady wage growth. We had a little bit of a lull in our most recent one. This is the general business survey, so this is all businesses. We're seeing very steady growth in the number of firms giving increases. We're seeing a very steady increase in those giving a wage increase of 5% or more would be considered very large in the way we think about wages. Okay. The other thing I want to show you is that we also ask firms to tell us how big they are, so we can kind of slice and dice the data. And the thing that we're seeing is that very large companies are giving much stronger wage increases. So, and that's important because large firms employ a disproportionate share of all employees, of all workers. So more workers are getting a higher rate of raise than the previous chart showed. The other problem is that we are hearing from small businesses that they are having trouble keeping up with that. So it's a kind of a compounding problem for small businesses. So why is the labor market so tight? In terms of, I think a lot of people think, well, they're just, they're just staying on the government dole and they're just, watching TV on the couch. Most data doesn't suggest that, okay? Unemployment insurance claims, here you have Minnesota and Wisconsin, either at or below where they were pre-pandemic. Okay, these are initial claims, so those that are asking for it, okay? Then you have continuing claims, those that are actually getting payments week to week. Again, right, basically back to where they were pre-pandemic. So that really isn't part of the problem. Much of the problem has to do with our labor force, a lot of our labor force trends in general. Okay, so I'll talk about two things. Basically, labor force population are those that are either employed or unemployed and looking for work, but they're only counted once. Okay. Labor force growth has slowed really dramatically. So if you go back to the 90s, my first 8 years, 1990, during the 90s, we saw really strong labor force growth in all three, US, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Roughly about 2000, we saw it really flatten out, okay, especially in Wisconsin, but it has also slowed down fairly notably from trend in the 2000, since 2000, and then you have here during the pandemic, okay. Worse is we have some lower labor force participation. Okay, so not only are the number of people in labor force is that trend flattening, the share of people that are interested in work is also going down. I'm going to show you that. Okay, again, roughly about 2000, you saw a very steady fall from about 75%. And again, the definition, share of those over 16 working or looking for work. Okay, 75% about 2000. Down to about 70% right before the pandemic. We thought that rate was going to go up. It looked like it was maybe starting to rebound a little bit. Pandemic hit, and now we're 2 percentage points lower than that. So we're 7% percentage points lower than our peak. That is a big, big number when you translate it into actual people. That is a big reason why we are not having those jobs filled. Now the question is, if they're not on unemployment insurance, what are they doing? We're trying to figure that out, frankly. There's a million reasons. I think you probably all know somebody who's working less and probably for very different reasons. Can't afford daycare, or maybe they just don't feel like that second income is worth it. Maybe they're not making enough and they kind of like being home, maybe with small children. There are lots of reasons why people have left. What we're not sure is how many are actually going to come back. So this chart kind of encapsulates the labor market right now. This is called the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. Okay, I'm going to go through each of these lines, top to bottom. So the top line, hiring demand. Okay, we've already known that it's going up. Actual hires, very flat for Minnesota, generally speaking. Voluntary quits. This is the most interesting line to me. Now, it doesn't look like it's a strong trend, but that is trend. We are seeing consistently rising rates of quits. Not that surprising because there's so many job opportunities out there. So if you don't like your job, chances are, if you're interested and willing, you can find something else. And then layoffs, this bottom line, as you would expect, if you have so much trouble finding labor, you're probably going to keep labor that you otherwise in a different market would have let go a long time ago. So even during, if we hit a softer patch during the coming 6, 12, 18 months, I don't expect, there are going to be some layoffs at that happen. I don't expect it to be as wholesale as you might otherwise see in a different recession, because firms have worked so hard to get the labor that they have, that I think they are probably more likely, unless something, if the bottom falls out, then all bets are off. But depending on a lot of factors, I do expect employers to hold on to employees more strongly than they would have otherwise. Okay, and it has led to record high job vacancies. So I'm curious from the room and from people online. So I've given you, there are a lot of jobs going unfilled. Why do you think that is the case? So this is a word cloud. Okay, so type me a couple of words. And I don't know if there are not many people participating here. Maybe I'll just skip this. In fact, maybe in the interest of time, I will anyways. I talk to a lot of businesses, and what I can tell you from businesses in terms of what they tell me, and they give me lots of reasons, but the ones that stand out, nobody wants to work anymore. That is the common narrative on why we can't fill jobs. Okay, I'm also not going to argue with you that that is true to a certain extent. Okay, motivation does have an issue. There are people that are willing to maybe game the system. What I would tell you is that it's a lazy generalization though. And the share of people that are doing that probably aren't going to help us move the productivity and jobs trend anyways. Okay, and I think it misses a much more complicated labor picture. Okay, research shows that people want to work. End of period. Full stop. Most people want to work. Okay. The problem is that job matching faces a lot of friction for people looking for work. As tough as that sounds, there's so many jobs out there, but for the people that are looking for work, I think they face more obstacles than the average person really maybe understands. And by overgeneralizing, I think we're misdiagnosing the real problems, and I think we're missing some real solutions that would benefit firms, benefit workers, benefit the economy. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about that for about the last 5 minutes. So part of the problem with the Fed, so we track the economy. We have typically done so through firms. So much like this audience, I can get a lot of feedback from you on how's business. Okay, are you hiring? Okay, great. Are you finding labor? No, can't find anybody. I think they're, who knows what they're doing. Okay, we were only getting views from the firm side. We weren't talking to workers about why aren't you working? Okay. What we have started is this worker experience initiative, and it sounds almost silly to say, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand the supply side of the labor market better. It's difficult because they're very disaggregated. We don't have very natural ways of finding those that, especially those that aren't working and aren't looking for work. Because there is a very large population that isn't working and isn't looking for work, but we don't know whether or not they might be willing to if circumstances were different. We're trying to do a little bit more of that. We're trying to find out what their objectives in job search is, what their job search experience is. Like when you're out there, what happens? Okay, because remember that labor force participation chart that went down 7 percentage points from 75 to 68? If we can't get that to rebound, lots of other challenges. I see that as a bigger long-term problem. Okay, so we don't know lots of workers that we can just go do man on the street. So we have started working with intermediaries, basically the organizations that work with job seekers. Okay, we've done a number of surveys over the last couple of months. Don't try to read the chart, I do it more for effect. Basically, what we've been learning from these intermediaries, these job search or these job service organizations, is that there are lots and lots of obstacles that an individual might come across. We wanted to get an idea of, okay, which ones really float to the top? And what we're finding is it kind of depends on who you're talking to. Different obstacles are more important for different kinds of people. Kind of sounds commonsensical, it is. But I think we're starting to get a more nuanced idea of what labor force participation is for certain kinds of people, okay? And they're also in 3 different, what I call buckets. So we know that there are some worker-based obstacles. There's the motivation issue, okay? You would be surprised at how many face transportation issues, okay? I had one manufacturer tell me, when I lose one person with a car, I lose 4 workers, okay? Because they're the ride, okay? So I think there are lots of issues. They may have low skills that they have to address, okay? But there are also some employer-based obstacles that I think employers have to start owning a little bit more. Their jobs might not pay very much. They may insist on an inflexible schedule, okay? We've, especially in manufacturing, we've kind of cobbled together schedules that are really good for efficient production, terrible for families, okay? Because they want weekends, they want nights, they want 12-hour shifts, okay? So again, there are things that employers, I think, have to own if they want to be more accessible to workers. And then there's this last kind of bucket is a little bit of a catch-all, and it's related to the economic environment and government policy. And I point to these top 2. Portability of daycare. And again, how I arrange this is the higher it is, you see the red bars, the more of an obstacle it is for more people. And what I consistently see are availability of daycare and housing where jobs are at, okay? Those consistently float up. It's not really the fault of the worker that they can't afford it. It's not the fault of the employer for sure, okay? But it's the economic context which happens, where job matching happens, okay? And if we don't figure out some way of addressing some of those, I don't think we can really expect some people to ever be able to come back into the market like we would expect. So what? Why does all of this matter? Why do all those worker obstacles matter? In the past, we had a labor surplus. Businesses were really foolish not to be choosy. You know, you're looking for the highest productivity person, okay? So you could afford to, and you were foolish not to be choosy in terms of the workers that you chose. In the present, though, there's worker shortage, and that means workers have leverage. And I think we have to pay attention to that leverage if we want more people to work. So I don't blame business owners if they don't want to deal. Running a business is hard enough, but now I got to worry about daycare, and I got to worry about whether they can get to the job and all of those things. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that if we don't pay attention to those, okay, I don't think things are going to get any better. Okay, it really requires a paradigm shift because it's about market leverage, and workers have leverage right now. If you think about some of the old sayings, you're lucky to have a job. And that was because you were lucky to have a job in a different labor market environment. You're not that lucky to have a job now because there's all kinds of them. And I think we have to kind of make that shift in thinking about how attractive is that job if I really want people to take it. And attractiveness means lots of things. And so from an employer standpoint, I really have a lot of sympathy for employers who are trying to figure out that dynamic while dealing with inflation and supply chain problems and rising interest rates. So I'm not saying that this is an easy one. This might be the hardest one, as a matter of fact, is dealing with people and finding the right people and keeping those people might be the hardest one of all of this, because we're dealing with humans, and humans are tough. So for any business owners out there and online, I really have my sympathy and my appreciation. I really have seen a tremendous amount of resilience among businesses. So I actually think they're going to rise to this. It just might take us longer than we hope. And we can decide to do nothing. Okay, that is an option here. But then we have to accept slower growth. Because if we don't increase labor force participation, okay, we're not going to grow as fast. The only way you can grow an economy, you can either increase productivity or you have to increase your labor force. Productivity, aside from recessions, when it tends to spike because people are afraid for their jobs, roughly below 2% annual productivity. So if we want higher than that, we have to grow our labor force. And so that's why we have to worry about this labor force participation if we want the economy to grow faster. Okay, one last question. I would really like everyone to participate in this. I want your help. Come on, there we go. So over the next 6 months, what's your outlook? And any questions have come across? Anyone in the group here? All right, we're gonna be getting done early then. Yeah.
How about something positive?
How about something positive?
Yeah.
Well, you're right. Yeah, you know, in talking about, well, here's the thing, you know, I would go back to my last comment is that businesses have been terribly resilient during this period. We're still seeing growth. Think about if you were to go back, you know, to take the pandemic out completely, you know, and, you know, cite us in some period that we're seeing some growth, 2005 or 2015, and now say, all right, I'm going to give you inflation, higher rates, supply chain problems, and this COVID thing. Where's the economy then? Oh, you'd say, holy cow, I'm running for the hills. And so my positive message to you all is that the economy is still growing despite all of that. And it's because businesses really have risen to the challenge. And I think in some cases, government policy has risen to the challenge of figuring out what all of these challenges are. I put much more of the credit to businesses, believe me, but they are been terribly resilient to all of these different challenges. And if we can get to the other side of even some of these, I think there's very strong growth on the other side. How's that?
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yes, sir.
Can I ask, one of the things you said earlier was that Minnesota, Wisconsin, I think we're like the bottom 10 of
Bottom 10 of the share of jobs lost during the pandemic that they've gotten back.
so what, can you speak to why that would be? I guess I'm just curious as to.
A little bit. There are lots of confounding factors, so I can't tell you it's because of this. What I can say is I look back to labor force. Okay, we are not. So one of the things I didn't mention, I think I might have mentioned in the slide, and I went past it. I'm just going to go through all this. You don't need to hear any more from me. Oops. There's my contact information for anybody that wants it. When you look at labor force, the population growth in Minnesota last year grew by 225 people. 225. It's normally 40 or 60,000. Okay, and if you can't grow your population, your labor force isn't going to grow. And so if your labor force isn't growing, they're not perfect matches to each other, but they're very related. The more people you have coming, either migrating there, you have, again, some of this population increased by natural birth. Obviously, infants aren't working, but again, it's a pretty steady relationship. Grow more, have more people in the state, there's going to be more jobs. So that is for the most part, that's why you see slower, a little bit slower return to normal in some of the upper, especially Great Lakes states. South Dakota and Montana are not part of that picture. So I think part of it might have been what you had in those states was a much softer business restriction. So you didn't see quite they're also different economies. So they didn't see the downturn as much in terms of the job shock, and they came back a little bit faster. But then you also have to figure in, okay, at what cost did that happen? The death rates from COVID significantly higher. So there's trade-offs in all of that, and I wouldn't want to say which one I think is better. Minnesota definitely lagging, but it's on a reasonably strong growth path. And the thing that I've also gotten out of the business is saying, who's won so far? I don't know. Give me in 5 years and I'll be able to tell you who really had the right approach to this whole managing this whole COVID thing. Because there is that balance between the economy and public health. And everybody in this room probably got a little bit different opinion than the person next. All I can tell you is that some of that probably is related to how quickly some states have grown their employment.
The other question, and thank you for that, was I think you had another graph that showed Wisconsin was really flat or dropping for quite some time prior to the pandemic. Thoughts on that? I guess that also surprised me a bit.
That I don't have a good answer to that. I think, again, what I can tell you is the population growth in Wisconsin was flatter. They are not attracting as many brown and black people. And that is, if you look, this is what I would talk about actually a lot more before the pandemic, is when you look at labor force growth and you look at population growth, the states that are growing are the states that are attracting more people of color, period. Okay, because our replacement rates, our white replacement rates are going flat, our fertility rates and things like that. Those states that are growing are attracting more minority workers, more minority households. And Wisconsin is doing a poorer job of that than Minnesota coming into the pandemic.
This might sound grim, but what impact the COVID deaths and long COVID had on all of these figures? I mean, are you starting to see the impact of just participation in labor rates?
You know, the one thing I can say is in terms of participation rates, seniors, I would point to them at first. Well, two groups. Women have been more impacted by COVID in terms of they tend to have more responsibilities at the home. More of them have left the labor force than the male population. I think we're starting to see that climb back closer to parity, but especially during the pandemic that happened. In terms of the seniors, in terms of labor force participation, that was one of the saving graces, is more people were working longer. And what we saw is that seniors are more nervous about COVID, so they're taking themselves out of the labor force more frequently than they were previous to the pandemic. Whether or not that rebounds, I think you will definitely have to see much stronger control of COVID before that really bounces back and goes not only back to where it was, but continues on that trend where it was. Any other questions? All right, well, I hope it was at least a good hour out at work. All right, thanks, Evan, I appreciate the invite.
Thank you, Ron. Great conversation, appreciate it. All right, that concludes today's seminar. Our next seminar is July 20th. At 1 p.m. we'll be hosting ECMC, who will discuss student loans and student loan forgiveness. So very timely topic. So hope you can join us for that. And again, thank you, Ron.
Pleasure to be here.